Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast is Abdul Rasul Div Salar. To his friends, he's known as Farzam. He's a political scientist who works as a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's also a visiting professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Università Cattolica in Milan. We recorded this on January 29th in the morning. My intent was to record this and then post it a week ahead of time so that we kept up our cadence of an episode on Monday and the weekly chats with Rob on Friday. I don't know that we're going to be able to sit on this that long just because of how dynamic things are in the Middle East and how we really did talk about the attack on some U.S. soldiers in Jordan at the beginning of the podcast. So we will probably push this out as quickly as we can. I will try to backfill so that there's an episode next Monday, but there might not be. So consider that you're going to get 3 this week and maybe 1 next week. The cadence always kind of works out. But I thought that Farzam's comments were really, really nuanced and really, really insightful if you're trying to think about how Iran sees the world. And if you're a U.S. strategic decision maker or an Israeli strategic decision maker or even a Chinese strategic decision maker, the level of sophistication and nuance in what Farzam is talking about should worry you a great deal, because I don't get the sense, at least from the policy choices that are emanating from all of these different capitals, that anyone quite has a sense of what Iran is up to. And for the first time, really in months, I feel like I have a handle on it based on what Farzam said. Of course, it's one viewpoint, and some of his analysis we can quibble with and disagree with. But for me, it was a really insightful episode, and I hope it was for you too, especially for a country as important and as confusing at times as Iran is, especially because of how hard it is to get information about Iran in the mainstream, especially English press. Okay, enough patting ourselves on the back for the episode. Email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or want to talk about our wealth management services or our research services, anything else like that. Take care of each other. See you out there. Okay, so Farzam, it's January 29th. It is 10:50 here, New Orleans time. I think it's about 5:50 or something like that, where you are in Geneva. I had this all scheduled out. We were going to talk today. We were going to post this next week. But in the last 2 days, things have gotten very spicy. So a drone that the United States says comes from Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Yemen has struck a U.S. facility in Jordan. 3 U.S. soldiers are dead. Biden has promised that the United States shall respond, to use his words. So that's sort of what's happening right this second, and maybe we back into Iran's strategic view, because that's really what I'm after here. I want to get a sense of what Iran's strategic view of everything is, not the hustle and bustle of the headlines, because the headlines are always there. But maybe let's just start with what is on everybody's minds right now, and we'll probably expedite the publication of this podcast. What happened from your point of view in Jordan, and what does it mean for the region in general? You can take the answer to that question whatever direction you want to go.
Well, let me first thank you, Jacob, for having me again in your interesting podcast, which I have the pleasure to appear every often, and it's a pleasure for me, really. Well, let me say that for sure there was not a good news, of course, for the family and the U.S. troops who lost their life there, but also for the region and for the regional security of the Middle East in general, because puts United States in a difficult situation of responding to this strike, which basically it's difficult and complex decision because it will have consequences. They're either responding or not responding. I mean, responding to the strike like that basically is a necessity to restore U.S. deterrence in the region and to prevent further escalation and further loss of the life of the American troops. And that seems what every U.S. administration and U.S. official takes as the right decision and something that should be done. But on the other side, any decision of responding, depending on how that response would be affected, the broader regional dynamics can cause a major escalation. What I mean is that if the U.S. response, of course, moves toward Iran, which basically some people argue that it's behind this attack, which there are lots of debates and uncertainties about this claim, can put Iranians in the same situation that the U.S. is right now. It means that put them in a sort of a situation that they need to respond in order to restore their deterrence. So basically, the risk here is about entering in a cycle of attacks and counterattacks, which are all justified by sort of attempt of states to restore their deterrence. And that, logical request that comes out of each of these capitals, dominates this sort of escalatory cycle that there are some points the risk that got out of the control and we face in a really all-out conflict. And here is a situation in a sense that makes it very complex for any decision makers. I mean, we have seen it for a while that both Washington and Tehran, which basically are on the two-end side of these conflict these days in the Middle East, have been very cautious, even in their statements and the way that they respond to, security threats and in the way that they conduct their operations in order to, send a very clear signal to the other side that they are not interested into an all-out war. I don't think that the calculus, neither in Washington nor in Tehran, have changed. I think both capitals are not interested in having a conflict, direct confrontation, because that's something that would take much more lives of the both sides, and the destruction that I have difficulty to imagine how can be restored. I mean, people tend to compare that with the Iraq War of 2003 or other U.S. Involvements in the region, but that's wrong because, all U.S. previous involvements in the region were with weak states or with basically fragile states. Taking example of, for example, Iraq. It was a state in 2003 after 12 years of constant bombardment and sanctions was quite militarily weak. It was no way a regional power like Iran. Or take an example of Afghanistan, which was, governed by a very fragile state with a sort of unconventional military. Iran is no way comparing to these two. It's a regional power. It has a very active and working deterrence in place, and it can cause a huge cost. Basically, it can activate multiple fronts across the region, and it can pose costs which goes simply beyond the Middle East. And that's why we're not just talking about any sort of conflict that we have seen before, at least after I should say, even after the World War II, because of the scale of the conflict that might easily take a whole region rather than two states involving together. So that's why all of these means that we are in a very delicate situation, and I'm really hope on the rationality and the control of the emotions of the both sides, because I say control of emotions because politics is an important part of that is emotions. We are all human at the end of the day, and we are get involved in the feeling of fear or responding back and things like that. But I hope that politicians are wise enough to take in consideration, together with their militaries, these points and control the cycle of violence more than this.
This is, first of all, there is so much to break apart in that answer. We will try to get to everything in there. I also just want to say that bit about emotions. First of all, if you're hoping for pragmatism to rule over emotional responses in the last couple of years in global politics, it doesn't feel like that's happening very often. So if that's what our hopes are based on, boy, are we in trouble. It also takes me back to some years of mine at Cornell that have nothing to do with geopolitics, but a mentor of mine back then, when I was more interested in 17th century music history than anything else. He was writing a paper about C.P.E. Bach, the lesser known Bach, and he was reading some of his work and talked about how in his work there was no distinction between thoughts and emotions, that thoughts and emotions were the same thing, and in some way thoughts were deeper held emotions. Anyway, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but you made me think of that.
Well, that's right. Let me make a point here. I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, there's very difficult to separate these things, but I know that I might seem naive, but I always like to put this positive vibe in the sense that in the hope on the matters, because still at the end of the day, hope is part of that emotion that that might, help all of us to get back, to restore the negative dimension of the events. I know it's usually, as you said, not been the case, but I should say sometimes being the case too. I mean, just look at the current situation. I mean, we are 3 months after the war that many people were predicting it is going to be a regional conflict the day after. Yep. That means that for the 3 months, all the state actors, everyone were quite wise, taking into the consideration that what escalation mean and how everyone will be the loser of escalation. There would be no winner in that escalation. And that means the control of emotion. That means that at some points, rational and a very clear calculation of the cost and effect, cost and benefits of our action will dominate the action, not just immediate reaction. And that's what I'm hoping to be continuing in the coming days and the weeks.
Very well said, and as my grandfather used to say, from your lips to God's ears. But there was so much in your first answer that I want to break apart, and I guess the place that I have to start is, and you sort of alluded to this when we were talking. You said that people say, the United States says that Iran was behind these most recent drone attacks that killed the American soldiers in Jordan. Is Iran behind it? Like, how would you answer the question of who has culpability for what happened in Jordan? If you had 60 seconds to brief President Biden about this, and you were giving him here's what happened and here's how you should be thinking about your response, how would you brief him in that 60 seconds?
Well, I think that's $1 million question, and you just can answer it if you have a very direct intel, and obviously I don't have that, so that's why I can just make analysis. But my understanding is that after the assassination of General Soleimani in 2020, Iran faced with a new era of managing and controlling its regional proxies, which was manifested by loss of a control, or a trend of a sort of trend of increasing autonomy of these actors, in a sense that, as you know, many of these actors are very much grown up in a sort of a context that they have their own interest, they have their own benefits from whatever action that they take. So basically, the argument here is that, apart from the fact that these groups were not created from the very first place by Iranian order, rather Iran tried to use the context which was in favor of it to orchestrate and to coordinate these groups toward a sort of objective. This is what Iran did. But Iran did not create it by the very first hand, these groups. Some of them, you may claim, yes, which they are very minor. But what is happening is that, at least during the Soleimani period, we were facing with a trend that Iran had a better communication and a better control over these groups. The post-Soleimani period started with the sort of, loss of the control over these groups. Then it was shifted toward a period which I think we are mostly in this phase, that Iran started to regain part of the control, rather not just by giving the sort of direct command of what these groups should do, but rather through the coordination mechanism, rather through the facilitation of the processes that these groups are involved. Rather than, yes, Iran is directly, I think, involved in provision of security assistance to these groups, means to provide them trainings, to provide them equipments, to provide them sort of coordination and intelligence sharing. These are the things that I think probably Iran is involved directly. However, there is still a certain level of autonomy on use of these trainings, equipments, and whatever these groups have. So the use, the moments, the the intensity of the use is not something necessarily. It's not like sort of a bottom in Tehran that people press and somewhere else have a sort of effect. So I see it from this perspective that I said. I think it's important to distinguish between when we say that how Iran directly was involved. Was Iran supporting these groups in different ways? Yes, Iran was supporting these groups. Iran was coordinating these groups. However, if Iran was directly behind certain attacks, each attack or each certain case should be discussed and explored in its own way, differently, and can be different. I mean, it can be operations that Iran directly were involved, and it can be operations that Iran directly were not involved. In this particular case, I believe that there are difficulties to say Iran was involved in the operation or in the commanding of the operation because of a certain reasons, and that's goes back to the Iranian strategy, which at this point is about not having a full-out conflict with the United States, not breaching with the already established rules of engagements and red lines between the United States and Iran, which was basically not killing Americans on the ground in the Middle East in expense of non-Americans, in return of non-Americans killing Iranians directly. So basically there were established red lines and rules of engagement. And I think what we see was that Iranians over the last 3 months were quite loyal to those rules of engagements. And there were Americans also the same way. They were very clearly signaling each other about avoiding the necessity of avoiding any sort of escalation. And I don't really see a change on that. What we see here is that in this particular incident, and in this particular group that was involved in this case, is that in this certain moment, you see there are a lot of frictions, a lot of loss of the control between Kataib and Tehran. So you had this group already been in Tehran, already been in a difficult time to managing the Kataib even before this incident. This was nothing hidden, and this was nothing that we were not aware of that. We know that Tehran's relation with Qatar was soaring and was not in its best time, and that relates to lots of other issues that is beyond our discussion. But basically, what we can see here is that this exactly friction was used by Qatar against the Iranian strategic interest, which at this moment, I will explain more that what was the strategic thinking in Tehran, but that's obviously different from having a clear conflict with the United States.
First of all, what a breath of fresh air to get actual analysis on this, because if you look at how this is being covered in most English language publications, you're not getting this perspective because that's way too nuanced for most people to publish. So thank you for sharing your insight. I also just want to underscore there that in some ways the United States continues to make the same mistake in the Middle East over and over and over again. It thought that by knocking out Iraq, it could control the region better and install a more stable actor. Instead, Iraq fell apart and it created ISIS and all these other things. It thinks that by knocking out somebody like General Soleimani, that it can restore more stability to the region. Actually, what you're saying is actually, no, we lost control of the proxies for a little while because you got rid of the guy who had his fingers on the button. You can apply this to Israel right now. You think wiping out Hamas, which is not possible, but is going to actually improve your situation? No, you're actually just creating a new generation of Hamas and probably more radical splinter groups. So there is this thing where, to your point, emotionally, people want to respond. They want retribution. They feel like they need some kind of emotional response. And then the response actually makes the situation worse because it knocks out the actors who are actually sort of in control here. So I take your point there, but I want to push you on it a little bit. So like, let's say I take what you just said for granted. In Tehran, when this last thing happened in Jordan, is Tehran just saying, oh, there go the proxies again, but we train them and we give them the weapons, but we're not in control of them. And hey, United States, we didn't push the button. Or is somebody in Tehran picking up the phone very angrily and saying, what are you guys doing? Stop it. We don't want this. Is there do you think there's an active frustration today in Tehran that a group went too far? Or do you think Tehran is more like, hey, like we don't control these groups. These are autonomous groups. Like they're going to do their own thing, United States. And if you have problems with them, like here are the rules of engagement, go after them however you kind of want. But we're passive. We're here on the sideline.
Well, I think the answer to this is a bit mixed because I think what we see immediate reaction of the Iranian was a sort of that frustration from a group that has gone too far. You see that in the statement of Foreign Ministry that completely tries to delink Iran with the recent attack and says that was not what we did and we were not engaged, like what has happened in the Hamas case, which I think it's again another case that shows that despite Iran's support of Hamas and its provision of security assistance for years, Tehran by the way, was surprised by the attack and the scale of attack itself. The way that Washington was surprised, the way that Tel Aviv was surprised, Tehran was surprised the same level in the same way, and that was now after 3 months. I think most of observers are approving this.
What are Iran's red lines? So what could the United States do, or Israel do, or somebody do that would override the pragmatic, we don't want a regional war consideration? Because I don't know what that red line is, and I'm curious if you have a sense of what it is.
It's a very interesting question, which I think no one clearly knows that red lines, and that's a problem by itself. I mean, in the American case, we're just somehow a bit more informed that the red lines are those, the American lives, soldiers on the ground. Those are very clearly the red lines. But what I can guess about Iranian red line is a direct strike to Iranian territories. That's a sort of probably the most clear red line, a sort of attack that can clearly attribute it to a certain country. That would be the red line and puts the Iranian government into a sort of situation that needs to react. Probably another red line would be, it's hard to argue that, but, many of IRGC and of its forces bases across the region, like in Syria or Iraq, have already been hit by Israel and have not really yet caused a major clear Iranian response to Israeli territories, despite the fact that, we have a lot of intelligence clashes over there. There are strikes against Israeli intel across the region. There are strikes against the shipping lines, which somehow at some points were linked to the Israeli operations in Syria. So basically there are asymmetrical responses to what Israel sometimes strikes to Iranian bases across the region. But in any way, we don't see it in a very clear way that Iran is obliged to immediately respond to any Israeli strikes to its targets across the Syria because of various factors, because many times Iran used deniability, completely denies that those bases were Iranian bases, or other times, sometimes martyrs or those officers who get killed in Syria or Iraq ideologically, serve the government in Tehran because, that's famous ideological belief of Islamic Republic that the blood of the martyrs will cause more martyrs, will help mobilization of revolutionary or ideological forces inside the country. So that's why very asymmetrical. While in the United States, red line is the blood of the soldiers, in the Iranian case, the blood of the IRGC guys might not necessarily be the red line because it might have some interest for the ideological underpinnings of Islamic Republic. So that's what I'm saying, that in my mind, what I see as a clear red line is the Iranian territory and a direct strike that can be attributed to one certain country.
Let me give you a scenario, because the United States, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the United States actually did strike Iranian territory back in 1988 when there were some disruptions around Red Sea shipping. Now, that's a very different Iran. It's a much weaker Iran. It's Iran that's reeling from the Iran-Iraq war. It doesn't have nearly the military capability that it does right now. It hasn't become a regional power. The United States has a very different relationship with the rest of the world at this point. So, it has happened previously.
They did an operation. Sorry, they did an operation, if you mean, but for making the people free. But it was not a direct military strike against Iran. I don't remember that.
Well, let me give you a scenario then. And I think this is a realistic scenario, and I was afraid it was going to be the scenario after October 7th. And I was not one of the people who was cautioning about regional war. I thought it was, on the probability tree, but it was not the thing that I thought was most likely. But what I did think was possible, and there's been a lot of reporting in Israeli publications the last couple of weeks that, this was a real discussion at the top levels of the Israeli government, and in some ways still is. What if Israel had turned around from October 7th, or what if after it finishes dealing with Hamas, what if it decides it can't abide Hezbollah on its border either, and it decides to go into Lebanon and try and defang Hezbollah once and for all, or to make up for the failed war against Hezbollah in the early 2000s. Is that a red line, you think, for Iran? If it saw Israel going after Hezbollah in a real way, would Iran trust Hezbollah to handle it for themselves and continue to offer security support, but still, sort of, hey, this is Israel and Hezbollah. This is not a regional conflagration. We don't want one. I'm trying to push and find a red line, and maybe you'll tell me that it's not there. But that's the most intense scenario I can imagine. How do you respond to that?
I still don't think Hezbollah is Iran's red line. I think none of the regional proxies are Iran's red lines, and this can be answered by going back to 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. That war lasted 1 month, and what Iran did was basically maximum providing trainings, operational planning, and again intelligence. Even at that time, provision of it, the weapon system during the war was very much limited. However, IRGC officers were involved in planning of the operation of Hezbollah against Israel. They were sharing intelligence and so on and so forth. So basically, even at that time, just as a historical example, shows us the red line was in no way Hezbollah. I think that has not been changed. Basically, and this goes back to Iran's broader, again, deterrence strategy, because these proxies are seen as two things. First, they are part of Iran's deterrence posture. They are part of Iran's deterrence logic, and it says everything. Means that deterrence means that you are creating them in order to prevent a strike, to prevent having a strike inside your territories. So you're not going to, because of them, to bring the war inside to your land, to your territories. So yes, there is a sort of flexibility, because the problem starts from the time that if people start to see in Tehran that first is Hamas, then is Hezbollah, then is Houthis, then is other proxies that are creating the pillars of Iranian deterrence, and then over some time they will completely lose this capacity. Well, that might be a different scenario, which remind me that I will explain that how this current in the strategic thinking how this current expansion of operation in the current military thinking of Iran means. But in your specific question in this case, my understanding is that for these deterrence elements, you don't go and welcome the war with the United States. That's how Tehran is seeing that. There is also another reason beyond deterrence ideas, and that's about the ideological underpinning of that. Many people believe that, there is a very, very deep ideological link between Iran and these proxies. Well, that's true, but at the same time, if you just go back to the ideological thinking of Iranian leaders, Islamic Republic leaders, back to the 80s, Khomeini, and especially also Khamenei, there is an idea of al-Ghura, where basically the core territorial, there is a territorial connection with these ideological discussions. And that territory that unites all these ideology is perceived to be Iran. So keeping that territory is critical for the ideological sake too, because if you just lose that territory, you will lose the possibility of revival of this ideology, of Islamic Shiite ideology in future too. So basically, keeping the land and preserving and safeguarding the land is just an ideological mission too. It's an ideological mission because it gives the chance to use it as the basis for that revolution, or that sort of ideological revolution, Shiite revolution that Islamic Republic leaders are believing on, which the 12th Imam and the messianic ideas that are behind that. So there's one ideological reason there, and then one deterrence reason that brings me to this conclusion that I don't think Iran goes to the war for its regional proxy, except in a situation, as I said, that it sees that if it does not intervene right now, its deterrence will collapse, and its internal and the next target would be itself, and so it's better to go and have a sort of forward defense. Then the concept of forward defense and how that will be linked with all these discussions should be explained to understand.
Interesting. Let's apply that, and this might be a chance to talk more about sort of Iran's general current strategic thinking to what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea. So the Houthis attacking Red Sea shipping and trade, at least rhetorically, in support of Hamas, and in rejection of the West's support of Israel in the Israel-Hamas Palestine war, whatever words you want to use there to be politically correct. How does that fit into Iran's strategic thinking? Because the Houthis are also a proxy. In some ways, Iran, I don't want to say it won the Yemeni civil war, but it prevented Saudi Arabia from winning the Yemeni civil war, which is a victory in and of its own right. But at the same time, shipping is down now in the Red Sea. You've got, prices, inflation is starting to creep up in some of these Western markets. I read a story this morning about how, produce from Europe that is supposed to get to the Middle East is spoiling on ships because they're going around the coast of Africa rather than going directly. So maybe we're going to see huge food inflation in the Middle East, which is not what anybody in the Middle East wants to see. Not to mention, what is this going to do to oil flows out of the Persian Gulf? Like, maybe it'll raise oil prices. At the same time, maybe it'll prevent oil from getting out from the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, which, cuts both ways for Iran. So talk to me about what Iran wants right now, and talk to me about how it sees the Houthis, because the Houthis in the Red Sea shipping disruptions for the United States, that's a first-order geopolitical challenge for the United States. Is it that for Iran? Is Iran happy to sit back and watch this kind of unfold? I don't have a good sense of how Tehran feels about this.
Well, that's an interesting question. To answer your question, I think we need to go back to Iraq War of 2003. I think one of the, which basically indoctrinated some certain lessons to Iranian strategic thinking that they are applying right now. One of the core thinkings that emerged after the Iraq War and was a result of Iran's study of the U.S. way of conducting the war was that they understood that Iraqis failed and lost the war in 2003 because they engaged with U.S. military in isolated operations. That means that because of the great capacity of U.S. military and the synergy that it can create between different branches of its armed forces, like between the Air Force, between the Navy, and the Land Force, the Space Forces, if you engage U.S. Army in one field or in one domain of the war, then you risk that other elements of this huge military machine come together, create a synergy, and completely crush you. That's what happened in Iraq. When Iraqis were unable to challenge U.S. in the sea, they were unable to challenge U.S. in the air, they were unable to challenge U.S. in the space, and they were concentrated in a ground sort of operation and to defend the U.S. strike, and that's resulted to a huge defeat. So I think one of the immediate lessons was from the Iranian side was that, well, we need to first of all, we need to expand the domains of the war. Means that if you want to engage with U.S. military, you should not let U.S. military to concentrate in one domain of operation. Then you need to disconnect the possible capacity of a synergy between these forces. Means that you need to engage U.S. if there's a war first from the sea. Then you need to engage its air defenses, and you need to engage in the air. You need to engage in the space. So basically, an important element came into. I'm saying this to let you understand that how the underpinning of strategic thinking inside Iran is when they see Houthis or they see Hezbollah or other regional proxies. So what they incorporate in their military doctrine from the, let's say, mid-2000 was the concept that let's build a capacity to engage with U.S. military in all domains at the same time, to kill the concentration capacity and to kill the synergy. And that's why if you see Iran's, for example, naval doctrine, you see that in the Persian Gulf, they operate below the sea, on the sea, above the sea. Amphibious spaces means between the sea and the land. So basically, they create a sort of complex threat environment that force U.S. military machine to use many more capacities that usually it operates only for a ground operation. So in this way, it increases the cost, it increases the capacity, and it forces the U.S. military to bring more resources that usually it can bring for a very simple operation. So the next stage of Iran's military doctrine was basically to export this thinking into the broader regional dynamic. Means that what if you create very complex very complex threat environment through different operational capabilities in a very, expanded geography, starting from the Mediterranean, then to the land operation in Iraq and Syria, then to the Gulf of Aden, then to the Indian Ocean and to the Persian Gulf. So you link all these conflict zones together. And imagine in this case, if U.S. military needs to answer, it needs to bring a huge amount of resources. It needs to use all of its different branches of the military. It needs to do a complex combined operations, bringing the Air Force, bringing the Space Command, bringing the ground forces, bringing the Navy, bringing all simply capacities of its military power to dominate and to basically conquer one zone. So basically what Iran is doing in a strategic thinking level is building a sort of a counter idea against U.S. zone defense concept, which basically was using one zone, isolate one zone, concentrate everything there, and defeat the enemy there, and then go to the next move, next zone. So this is how U.S. operated in Iraq, how U.S. usually were planning in its military operations, and that's what we are seeing Iranian counter operational concept coming to the fourth. In which that's why what I see in Yemen, based on these smaller operations across the region, as a demonstration of Iran's military strategy, as a part of a deterrence, because it tries to signal first to Israel and then to the United States that, look, you cannot strike Iran, because if you strike Iran, means that we are going to activate all these domains, means that you already will engage in a huge conflict, that this conflict needs to bring all of your resources. Then remember that you have the issue in Ukraine, and then remember you have the issue in the China, and then you have a broader global security dynamic. So basically, it's true that the United States is a superpower militarily, but still it has a limited resources. If you force it to bring huge amount of its resources to respond to one regional conflict. So that's how Iran, tried to demonstrate this capability that it can coordinate sort of attacks in a very large geographies, and which were basically they are coordinated and they're interlinked together, and they can create synergies. This is one concept. The another thing I think, another argument that I think Iranians are using these days is a sort of learning from the Ukraine war, and that is about internationalization of the regional conflicts or the local conflicts. If you see, anyway, we like it or not like it, Russian attack to Ukraine was a local war in a geographical definition of that. It's limited to some some areas. But what Russians did through the grain deal, through the shelling of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine, was pushing was exporting the cost of this war to a broader geographies, which were not initially part of the war in the first place. So basically, by internationalization of the war, they try to pose cost on the other actors. That's what Iran is doing right now through the Houthis in the Red Sea. It is showing that unless you do not resolve the issue in the Israel and Palestinians, you're going to bear this cost. And then lastly, as part of the important part of Iran's strategy thinking is the consideration or the concept of time. They are very conscious about the issue of the time. They want to show the capacity that they can go to attrition war. They can create attritional war. They can prevent the strategies that look for decisive immediate victories. This was how Israeli operations for decades been, right? So what Iranians are doing or their original proxies somehow are playing with this concept of time, and the creation is sort of an idea of a counter decisive operations.
Yeah. I hear you. And so I guess where that goes, though, first of all, that's an incredible explanation of Iran's strategy, and I hope that U.S. and Israeli strategic decision makers are listening, but judging on their behavior, maybe they're not. But what happens when you start exporting the costs of the war, not just to your enemies, but also to your allies? And I'm thinking here specifically of China, because China, for all of its interests in a multipolar world and weakening the United States, and maybe the South China Sea can be another one of these regions where the United States doesn't have enough force that it can bring to bear, China also really can't deal with a world where Chinese exports can't get to market on time or for higher prices, where they can't import reliably foodstuffs or energy supplies, especially from the Middle East. Is there a point at which the export of the cost of this war is going to start hitting on China? And is China going to call Iran and say, hey, like, we have an understanding, you need to pull back a little bit? Does Iran not think about China as an ally? Is China just a nation out there and China's going to have to deal with it itself? There have been some talks of, friendship agreements and this, that, the other. I don't put a whole lot of stock in that, but I wonder if that is also a thinking in Iran's mind, because when you start internationalizing conflict, yes, you can go after maybe some of your enemies, but you can also create enemies in interesting spaces that maybe you didn't think you had enemies in before.
I mean, that's a very interesting question, and that's why we need to come back to the definition of ally. I don't think China and Iran are allies. I think, yes, they have this strategic agreement, sort of a plan for, as has been argued, $400 billion of trade, which I see very unrealistic. But remember that, they're not allies. They are not in no way have strategic bonds or strategic commitments to each other that can define them as allies. And even the other way, they have lots of issues. I mean, especially right now, the China-Iran relation is a very delicate time. I'm not saying they have a problem, but they have issues ongoing, right? One of the most important one of them is this issue of Iranian islands in the Persian Gulf, which Chinese supported the Emirati claims on that. I think that irritated Tehran hugely, and they are thinking to create leverages over China that can be used to tackle with this issue, or just to let Chinese know that, look, you cannot do whatever you want. So basically, putting it in another perspective, one can argue that the current Houthi thing, creates new leverages for Tehran when it engages into discussion with Chinese, and when it wants to force Chinese to go ahead with its own view of the regional security. So, I mean, to put it very simply, I don't see that China really. I see that China is an important partner on economic front. Is one of the only countries that have a friendship relation with Iran that supports Iran's integrity and security interests, but that does not at all mean that they are on the same page in many areas. It does not mean that they have on every dimension, especially on security dimensions, shared interest. And just the last point on this matter is that I think Iranians also see the issue with the China in a sort of complex picture, because they believe that they are giving to Chinese a lot of concessions. Like, for example, one of those concessions was giving the grant of being the mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. That was Iran and Saudi Arabia who gave this chance to China. The Beijing obviously was not part of this reconciliation process. It was a latecomer, but these two countries decided to give this, sort of gift to Chinese. So I think there are lots of complexities in this case, and I don't see really that China is at least have that sort of direct capacity to or direct even interest to ask Iran or to push Iran toward anything on Houthi thing until Tehran think that there are important security benefits of the continuation of Houthi operations.
Does Iran have any allies?
Well, if you define allies as a sort of US, EU, or NATO type partnerships? No, I don't think. I mean, even Russia is not Iran allies. It's a partner. Yes, they have important partnerships, but they have lots of conflicts of interest and disagreements over important things. And by the way, one of them is the islands in the Persian Gulf, which caused irritations between Moscow and Tehran relation too.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question here. I know I'm keeping you when it's late. And this is not your wheelhouse, but I hope you'll apply it to your wheelhouse. You sort of mentioned how Iran is not the Iraq of the early 2000s. It's not Afghanistan. It's not a fragile state in the same way, and it's a regional power. That said, the supreme leader is old. He's been ill at least, a couple times in the last couple of years. There's been stories about, is he trying to groom his son? Is that causing, pushback from the regime or from parts of the regime? There's the sort of pragmatist versus cleric dynamic that's also there within Iran. One of the narratives that I've seen sort of is that the situation is stable until the supreme leader passes away. But once he passes away, this could be a free-for-all. And Iran's domestic regime might look very, very different in the sort of power struggle that emerges once he passes away. I'm not sure how much I buy that narrative, but I wonder if you find any credence in that narrative. Do you think that, when the supreme leader passes away, and we don't know when it could be 2 weeks from now, it could be 20 years from now, who knows? But do you think that that there is an underlying domestic fragility here that affects Iran's power projection? Or do you think that that's overstated? That yes, maybe there is internal competition, but that will be resolved and it's not going to affect Iranian deterrence or Iranian power projection or Iranian policy in any meaningful way?
Well, that's a very important question, because I think the supreme leader is the one that will very much define the future of Iran. And the current supreme leader, under the current supreme leader, I think we will not see many of those things that we wish to see, like U.S.-Iran normalization or Israel-Iran normalization and things like that. But I should say that because of the importance of this position, because of the strategic competition, as you said, internal competition that exists on this matter, I think the current Ali Khamenei, current supreme leader, is doing his best to secure a sort of, let's say, soft and clear transition to the next leader. And he's doing that by restructuring and reshuffling the actually assembly of experts, which is the institutional process that selects the next supreme leader. And beside that, what they're doing is unifying the intelligence apparatus, which is the Ministry of Intelligence and the IRGC's intelligence organization, that very much can, suppress any internal, opposition to this process, or they can suppress literally any political opposition also to this process. So I think what we are seeing is a very clear demonstration of the willingness of the supreme leader to control the process of the leadership selection after his death. Or this we cannot come up with the names that who will be that person. There are lots of speculations, but I don't want to speculate because I don't see that quite clear really at the moment. But what I can say on the process is that through this unification of assembly of experts and strengthening the power of the intelligence intelligence organizations and the IRGC in this process, what we are seeing is the empowerment of the IRGC and intel community, plus the hardline clerical figures in Iran that will define the supreme leader. So in this context, I don't see that the chance of a huge internal chaos would be very much high, because, well, there is the mechanisms in place to control possible opposition to the process. Of course, we will see definitely a huge crackdowns and a huge sort of internal limited violences or suppression of the political figures. But at least this is how these groups are trying to to architecture this process of leadership selection to go with very smooth and without a major issue among themselves that are, as I said, the hardline principalists.
My friend, thank you for your time. I know it's late, so we'll stop there, and we'll probably have you back on sooner rather than later, because unfortunately I don't think what's going on in the Middle East is going to calm down anytime soon. So take care of yourself.
Thank you.
And hopefully I'll buy you a coffee or something in Geneva here soon.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's always so nice and so good talking with you.
Yeah, imagine if the U.S. and Iran could talk like we talk on the podcast. Maybe things would be a little bit better. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.